Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 21st of December of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Kherson direction. As you can see, we have a lot of very interesting geolocations. According to information, according to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, as a result of clashes on this area, the Ukrainians lost another 70 soldiers, 3 armored vehicles and 2 artillery systems. As you can see, there is a small difference today in comparison with the previous days. We start receiving more updates, more geolocations from the Ukrainian bank of Dnipro River. The Russians, during the previous few days, there was a small operational pause, maybe due to the weather or other different circumstances, very difficult to understand, but we see that the Russians renewed their attempt to attack this territory. Furthermore, after a very long operational pause for up to 1 month, the Russians renewed their Lancet strikes against the Ukrainian forces in the vicinity of Tyaginka. And this is very important because there was a reason of operational pause, why the Russians stopped bombing the Ukrainians with Lancet, why the Russians stop attacking Ukrainians with FAB 500 in this area. And the main reason of that is that the Ukrainians stopped supporting their forces on this bank of the river. There was no need to support. When the Ukrainians brought artillery closer to the bank of the river, the Russians destroyed everything with Lancet strikes. When the Ukrainians tried to concentrate forces in Tyaginka, Ivanovka, Olgovka, the Russians were bombing and attacking everything with FAB 500. So that's why we discussed, this is the reason why the number of forces that Ukrainians keep in Krynki reduced from 1 battalion to just few campaigns, from 400 soldiers to 100 soldiers. And but the question is, we understand why the level of Ukraine activity on their bank of the river reduced by, but now the question, why they took a decision to intensify their activities. And there might be few questions to this answer. First of all, the Ukrainians are planning to, let's say, send significant number of Marines and troopers on this bank of the river with the last attempt to penetrate the Russians' defense belt, to increase the foothold in this area, and let's say to force the Russians to step back in Crimea. But highly unlikely the Ukrainians have such resources. Obviously, the Ukrainians are planning to evacuate the rest of Ukrainian forces in this area, but to do this, if there are like 100 soldiers, they need to evacuate them, and if they want to evacuate them, obviously the Ukrainians need to start bombing the Russians with artillery forces. They need to have some, I don't know, raiders, FPV drone operators. They need to suppress the Russian artillery forces and so on. For example, today we got significant number of geolocations from the Ukrainian side. Just for the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians published few videos. For example, on this video we see how the Ukrainians managed to destroy another Russian tank that the Russians were using to support the Russian forces and to attack the Ukrainian forces in Krynki. This tank was damaged and then there was an explosion. Also, the Ukrainians published the video how they destroyed few artillery systems in the vicinity of the village Nova Mayachka, and there was another strike inside of the city. There was a small base of the Russian forces, and as a result of HIMARS strike, the Ukrainians managed to destroy a machine, 1 truck and few armored vehicles. Furthermore, we got another video how the Ukrainians destroyed another Russian Grad system. So at some point of this operation, the Ukrainians have redeployed significant number of artillery forces to the combat line and start suppressing the Russian forces. Once again, 2 reasons of that. Either the Ukrainians took a decision to send another wave of infantry, of Marines, to develop and to break the situation, or the Ukrainians wants to evacuate soldiers from this territory. I think, my opinion, that the Ukrainians took a decision to evacuate forces, and now they're just trying to suppress the Russians, and soon that means that maybe the days of Krynki foothold are numbered. Now we are moving, before we go into the Zaporozhye area, let's discuss another interesting video from Odessa, another act of democracy in Odessa. On this sense, you can see how the Ukrainian recruit officers use ambulance truck to make ambushes for regular Ukrainian men somewhere in residential area. On this video, a man and girl was walking along the streets, and ambulance machine got close to them after that, few very powerful men left machine and capture the regular Ukrainian person. So as you know, it's illegal thing to use cars with the signs of ambulance in the world for any other matter, but not as ambulance. It's a crime. It's a military crime in this case. You can't use these machines for these purposes. But as I understand, the Ukrainians don't care about this. Another important thing that you need to note, that now the Ukrainians are breaking the law, not just Ukrainian law, but international law, and Zelensky still hasn't adopted the total mobilization law. Imagine yourself what is going to be when the Ukrainian parliament will adopt the real total mobilization law. It's very even difficult to imagine what is going to be next after that. Now we are moving further. Another important update is coming from Crimea. During the day on the 21st of December, the Ukrainians made another attempt to attack the Crimean bridge with ATACMS missile, but the Russians reported they managed to discover the missile and to shoot this missile down. And as you can see, also this very important event, but because this attack take place at the same time with Ukrainian intensifying of actions in Kherson direction. So obviously the Ukrainians can't just withdraw their positions from Krymki, because if they do this, this is going to be another media failure that Zelensky or Zaluzhny will be responsible for. And the only way how the Ukrainians can withdraw their positions in Krymki, they need to create another media victory. And of course, if the Ukrainians were able to destroy or to damage Russian Crimean bridge, that would be significant operation, significant media victory. And during this victory, the Ukrainians might not just withdraw their position from Krymki, but also from Avdiivka, and nobody cares. And now we are moving to Zaporozhye area. We have a lot of very interesting updates from Bradley Cake. The Russians managed to cut another piece of cake from this territory, and the main clashes during the previous 24 hours took place on the western flank of this village. Furthermore, first of all, the Russians started artillery preparation. The Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces along these three lines, and the battle for Robotyne has its own specific things. You know that this land, this territory used to be agricultural territory that Ukrainian companies were using for making potato, for making grain, and different types of agricultural things. And so that's why, as you can see, Robotyne fields are cut between each other with the tree lines. So this is like something like borders of one land from another. During the special military operation, either the Russians and the Ukrainians start using these tree lines as the main fortifications area. And now the same tree lines is the best situation how to capture another thing. So you don't need to make broad frontline attacks. They don't need to storm city. You don't need to use significant number of forces. The only thing you need is to capture one sector separated from another with tree lines after another. And this is exactly what the Russians are trying to do and have been trying to do since the previous 2 or 3 weeks. For example, on this sense, we see the artillery preparation. After the Russians managed to suppress the Ukrainian positions, machine gun positions, anti-tank forces, sniper positions, the Russians launched the storm operation. For these purposes, the Russians were using just 1 tank and 2 armored vehicles or 2 personal carriers. This is the Russian route of attack, and as a result of that attack, the Russians managed to enter the tree line and obviously to clear and to capture and to dig in deeper. And this video was published by the Ukrainian forces, by the Ukrainian sources. We see 3 armored vehicles. The tank was moving in the head of convoy. 2 armored vehicles were behind. The Russians were moving across the fields. The fields were demined in the past. The Russians managed to land the infantry and to continue or proceed offensive operation. This video was published by the Ukrainian sources, so we will not see the glorying Russian victories or something like this. We're gonna see just the FPV drones from the Ukrainian side, but this video confirms and shows us the Russian attempts to attack in the northwestern part of Robotyne. And this very important attack, I'll explain to you why. As you can see, the Russians were moving in this direction, and according to information we have, as a result of that offensive operation, the Russians managed to establish control over these 3 lines, over another field that is separate from other fields with these 3 lines. So this is the Russian progress, and based on that we understand that the Russians will try to move further. Maybe after a day, after a week, they will try to establish control over the next field in the same area. And the next Russian goal and projection plan is to get this line. Why is that? If the Russians are able to capture this field as well, they will be able to establish complete fire control over the main road that goes from Orekhovo-Novodanilovka to the south in direction of Robotyne. And this operation, these two let's say, operations will allow the Russians to half encircle Robotyne from the northwest, from the west, and of course from the southwest, from the south, and from the southeast. This village will be half encircled, and of course the Ukrainians will not have any chances to hold this village for a long time. They will be forced to step back. Furthermore, I'll remind you that just during the previous week we got a lot of geolocations of Russian attacks from this direction, which also confirms that the Russians are attacking Robotyne like another like Robotyne pincers. This is another wave of attack, another direction, and this is the second one. So the Russians are trying to encircle Robotyne from 2 sides, and as I understand, they're gonna do this. I'm not saying, I can't tell you the timings when exactly the Russians are able to do this, but it's not so far when the Russians will cut the main road, and after that the days of Robotyne will be numbered. According to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, as a result of clashes, bombardments, active Russian defense, the Ukrainians lost 75 soldiers and 4 armored vehicles. Once again, I'll remind you why the Russians do have chances to complete this battle successfully and to return everything that they lost during the Ukrainian greatest counteroffensive. The Ukrainians just during the previous months have redeployed 5 fully blooded, very powerful brigades. I'm talking about 47s mechanized, I'm talking about 116s, I'm talking about 46, I'm talking about probably 21st and 33rd. Maybe I'm wrong about the last 2, but I read article today about 5th Brigade that were redeployed from this area. So anyway, there is a gap. There is a real gap. The only thing Ukrainians still have 117th, 33rd, and 118th and 82nd. So it's nothing in comparison with the quantity and quality of brigades that Ukrainians used to have in this area even 2 months ago. Now we are moving to the South Donetsk direction, and we got madness, just madness. It's not, we can't call it this an update. The madness is coming from the South Donetsk direction. First, we're going to talk about Ugledar. According to the Russians, as a result of clashes on this area, the Ukrainians lost another 65 soldiers, 4 armored vehicles, including 1 tank and 2 artillery systems. Today, either the Russians and the Ukrainians were attacking each other with FPV drones. The Russians published the video how they start the clearing operation along these 3 lines. So it's the first step before the Russians launched their attack. If you remember, in November, the Russians made few attempts to attack these 3 lines from Nikoyska. We haven't received even a single geolocation from the Russian side. The main videos we received from Ukrainian sources, and on those videos we remember significant number of Russian armored vehicles that were destroyed during those attacks. And we didn't change the map because we didn't receive even a single geolocation of Russian progress. And today, on the 21st of December, the Ukrainians themselves published the video of November, how of the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, how the Ukrainians were attacking abandoned Russian tanks in this area with FPV drones. You know that when a tank is abandoned, it doesn't mean that the Russians or the Ukrainians were defeated. It just means that infantry is somewhere around in the trenches, trying to dig in deeper, waiting when the main enemy forces will counterattack them. So on this video from the Ukrainian side, we see probably a progress of the Russian forces during the November offensive operation, and this is the progress, at least along these 3 lines. Maybe the same progress we can find on the rest of the 3 lines that located to the right from this one, but we don't have any geolocations to prove this. Now we're moving to Novomikhailivka. A lot of very interesting details in geolocations. Just before we start, according to some Russians, the Russian forces managed to establish control over this sector as well, and they also have almost half encircled Novomikhailivka from the south, and they managed to basically to break the Ukrainian defense belt. And now we can start counting days when the Russians launch their ground operation. The Russians continue bombardments of the city, of the village, or the ruins that left from the village with FAB 500, with FAB 1500, with TOS flamethrower systems, with Ulmur missiles. So the village is under very heavy fire. I'm not sure the Ukrainians are able to hold this territory very long, but the Russians, as you can see, are trying to play a safe game. They're not going to risk. They have already lost significant number of troopers during the storm operation. Now they want just to be everything secured. And the only problem for the Russians, you need to understand simple thing, that there are no problems for the Russians to capture Novomikhailivka. The only problems the Russians have is the minefields. So we might say that I must say that every single field, let's say this territory, this is a complete one big minefield. This is another one big minefield from the Ukrainian side, and maybe it's just a regular, let's say 200 300 meters, but there are hundreds of mines on these 300 meters, and this is the most difficult part to bypass for the Russian infantry and basically for the stormtroopers. And this is the main headache for the Russians, and now they're trying to find a solution how to pass this final defense belt, the final 300 meters. And when talking about the eastern flank, probably the Russians found a solution. You know that some very interesting guys from the Russian side are working on this area, because today the Russians, probably for the 4th or 5th time exactly on the South Donetsk direction, use Kamikaze machine, Kamikaze tank. This is the simplest solution how to demine fields. On this video we see Russian tank or Russian armored vehicle that moves very slow, because these armored vehicles is fully loaded with different types of explosive, and this tank is moving not on the Ukrainian positions, because the Ukrainian positions are very far from this area. The Russians are moving towards minefields. The main purpose is to make a very heavy explosion and to demine and to clear the area and to make a safe road for the Russian infantry to enter the eastern part of the village. So this is the video. The Russian armored vehicle is getting closer, The Russians are following. The Ukrainians are doing the same, because the Ukrainians understand that after the explosion, the Russian infantry will start its movement. So this is the explosion. One machine, very heavy explosion. This video was geolocated. You can take this electrical energy facility. This is the energy facility, and this is the energy facility on the map. So it's like the eastern outskirts of the village, and we see that the map is correct, showing the real Russian progress. So obviously after that, the hordes of Russian forces entered and attacked the Ukrainians on the east. So minefields, why is minefields is so big problem? For example, in the previous video, in the morning update, we have already discussed another Russian attempt to attack. Significant number of Russian forces, troopers, marines who was trying to storm Novomikhailivka, but basically they got a simple minefield, and they haven't managed to bypass like another 400 meters, and their armored vehicle got on mine, and they basically were forced to stop, regroup, and to retreat, because it's not a very good idea to attack unknown area fully let's say loaded with the Ukrainians without any support of armor, and they were forced to step back. So without solving the problems with the minefields, there are no chances to capture Novomikhailivka. But as we just saw, probably the Russians have already managed to find a solution. Furthermore, we got the first video from the southern outskirts of Novomikhailivka. On this video we can see the cemetery. This is the cemetery, this is the farms, and as you can see, cemetery, and this is the cemetery on the map. And there is the Ukrainian tank that was damaged and destroyed as a result of Russian maybe anti-tank fire or FPV drone strike. But this is already the clashes on the border. This is not something like in the fields or not Kamikaze tank. This is already the outskirts, the border, the territory of Novomikhailivka itself. So once again, 20th of December is the first official day according to military summary, of course, of Battle for Novomikhailivka. Maybe the Russians started the ground operation earlier, but just yesterday we started receiving more or less geolocations that confirms this piece of information. Now we are moving to the north in direction of Avdiivka, where we also got a lot of very interesting details and updates, and the most important are coming from the square Stepova, Novokalinova, Krasnogorovka. Few things about this territory. First of all, according to information we have, the Ukrainians completely left Stepova. According to the Russian sources, the Ukrainians still haven't confirmed this piece of information, but according to the Russians, the Ukrainians were forced to step back as a result of pressure, significant pressure from the Russian side, according to the Russians. If you ask my opinion, I'll share with you, I'm telling you that probably Stepova was reduced to ruins, and there were no more places where the Ukrainians can feel themselves in the safe and strong position. They basically took a decision to step back towards more reliable positions. So now the Ukrainians are trying to repeat the same story as the Russians made in Robotyne. The Russians didn't fight for anything. If they see that the Ukrainians are too close, they withdraw their positions and made a one step back, then another, and during all these small steps, the Ukrainians lost up to 200,000 soldiers, according to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, a little bit less, right? So now this is the same story, and now the Russians have problems because if the Russians will continue offensive operation, and they will continue, now the Russians need to dig in deeper and to try to establish their positions on the western part of Stepova, which was reduced to ruins during the previous months of clashes. So for now, the Russians are saying that everything is okay and that Stepova is under Russian control, and now the next step is Berdichi. I won't be so fast because first I will say the same as the Russian sources are saying, that Avdiivka news is tightening, that the hatch of the Avdiivka cauldron has been closed only after we start receiving the first updates on the eastern part of Berdichi. As soon as we get the first geolocated video somewhere from the eastern part of Berdichi, this is going to be the final day of Avdiivka, because this is going to be the end. It's going to be the end, maybe not like in the real meaning, because there are going to be still clashes, counterattacks, but this is going to be the turning point when the Ukrainians will not be able to do anything after this point. Furthermore, the Russians continue advancing to the north. As we discussed in the previous video, the Russians are moving along the railways from Stepova in direction of Ocheretino, and the Russians are moving along the railways from Krasnogorovka to Ocheretino as well. And we have some geolocations, and as a result of mappers and geolocations, the Russians managed to establish control over this territory during the previous few days. We will update the map before the next morning update. Now we are moving to Bakhmut area, where we got also significant number of different details and updates. According to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, as a result of clashes on this area, the Ukrainians lost 210 soldiers, 3 armored vehicles and 7 artillery systems. So we can see complete Russian artillery superiority. The Russians, according to information we have, managed to penetrate the Ukrainian defense belt. Some sources are saying that the Russians also entered Bakhmutovka from the northeast. This is currently the Russian controlled territory. Furthermore, we got confirmation, geolocated confirmation of Russian progress along the railways. On this video we can see the Russian storming process, the movements of infantry, the passing by from one checkpoint to another. So now we have 100% sure confirmation of Russian progress above this territory. We don't have any updates about the railways further, but probably this territory is also under Russian control, but we will keep these areas in the gray zone. Furthermore, we got complete confirmation that the Russians established full control over the Chernobyl's residential area, and now the Russians less than 6 meters in front of Ivanovsk, and probably there are already sniper duels. And as we discussed, the main Russian goal for winter campaign on this territory is to capture and establish control over 2 villages. Ivanovsk is the primary target for the Russians, and which will allow the Russians, the main reason why the Russians will try to attack Ivanovsk, they want to cut this territory in 2 parts. If the Russians can take control over Ivanovsk, they will be able to create something like this. They will get canal, and this territory, this entire Bakhmut front line, will be split in 2 parts, the northern one and the southern one. Everything that located to the south in Klishchiivka and Andreevka will collapse automatically, or the Ukrainians will have 2 long supply roads from Alexandra Shultina and then Konstantinovka. This is going to be completely separate area from Ivanovska. Furthermore, the Russians will create the next operational area, Bogdanovka-Grigorievka, and if the Russians can take Ivanovska, obviously the next step from their side is going to be to take control over Orekhovo-Vasilievka, and they will try to get Canal as well from the north. And then they're gonna handle with Georgievka, Bogdanovka, Kalinovka areas separately. So this is the main plan, to get Canal during this phase of winter offensive military campaign. Furthermore, the Russians continue bombardments of the Ukrainians on the main hill in this area, and so they're trying to suppress. This is not the first geolocation from this territory. Just during the previous 2 days we have 2-3 of very heavy bombardments, and the main purpose of these bombardments is to suppress the Ukrainians, to pin them down and not to allow them to raise their heads. And now we are moving further to Liman front line. We got a lot of very interesting updates from this territory. According to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, as a result of clashes on Liman direction, the Ukrainians lost 190 soldiers, 3 armored vehicles and 1 artillery systems. And as you can see, for the first time probably since the creation of this front line, we received significant number of geolocations from both sides, either from the Russians and from the Ukrainian. On this video we can see the Russian attack among the fields, and as a result of that attack, of series of attacks that the Russians were trying to implement from different directions, they managed to encircle the Ukrainians and to capture and establish control over this forest and tree lines. If you remember, we discussed this territory a few weeks ago. Deep State map, Syriac map, a lot of mappers have already updated their maps 2 weeks ago, but we colored these territories in the gray zone because we haven't received even a single geolocated confirmation. And just 2 weeks later, we start receiving some updates of those events, of how the Russians were storming this territory. Significant number of infantry at different attacks from different directions, from the north, from the south, from the east, and as a result of those clashes, all this territory was captured by the Russians. This video, by the way, was published by the Ukrainian sources, and they were publishing this video as FPV drones and cluster rounds bombardments of Russian forces. So just a regular propaganda video from the Ukrainian side to show at least something, but basically they confirmed additional Russian progress in this area. But this is not the most important video, because the most important updates are coming from the line between Yampolovka, Terny and Novosadovo. For example, on this video we can see destroyed Ukrainian convoy. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, at least 7 points or 8 points on these among these fields, probably showing the destroyed or abandoned armored vehicles by the Ukrainian side. The Ukrainians were trying probably to counterattack the Russian forces. They created a convoy, and maybe the Ukrainians were trying to send their forces to the south in direction of that forest, but the Russians made an ambush and basically they destroyed everything that were moving in Russian direction with artillery fire, maybe with flamethrower strikes, or maybe with aviation bombs, I don't know. But as a result of that ambush, the Ukrainians lost significant number of armored vehicles. Furthermore, we got another video a little bit to the east, further to the east. On this video we can see how the Ukrainian tank, probably Leopard, was running away from the combat line. It's very difficult to understand why exactly the Ukrainians were running away, but the tank was damaged as a result of FPV drone strike and later was destroyed. The thing is that according to this video, if we return back a little bit, we're gonna see this is the Ukrainian tank. This is the Ukrainian tank who was moving back to the Zhiribets River, and he was striking in this area. So the Ukrainian tank was moving something like this along these fields. That was the, like say, the road of movement, and somewhere here the Ukrainian tank was damaged by the Russian FPV drone, but before he was damaged, he had time to attack the Russian forces somewhere along this tree line. So as I understand, according to this geolocation, according to these few evidences, the Russians, as a result of clashes on Liman direction, probably managed to establish or to achieve huge progress and to capture all these tree lines and this territory. So significant result, and as you can see, the Russians are getting closer and closer to Zhiribets River. And this is like the results, and this is the, let's say, the territory updates that completely correlates with the Russians' numbers of Liman direction. Now we are moving to Kupiansk front line. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes in Kupiansk area, the Ukrainians lost another 55 soldiers and 2 armored vehicles. We haven't received even a single geolocation from the Russian side. We have just Ukrainian videos of FPV drone strikes on the north of Sinkovka. The Ukrainians have some certain fire control over the main supply roads that the Russians used to send their forces on the northern part of the village. So no changes on the ground. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.